So this is our first topic of these educational seminars. I'm going to be talking about the role of carrier screening during family planning and whether we're moving from prenatal to preconception testing. Now, in our company, we've been doing prenatal testing for over 15 years, but it is our strong belief that with the technology that we now have on our hands, we are in a position to move from prenatal testing to preconception testing. And there are a lot of advantages, as you will see in the course of my presentation, to conduct preconception testing rather than prenatal testing. I've put this slide because I'm used to giving seminars to a live audience, and I can normally see people's faces and I can see the reaction. Unfortunately, due to circumstances, we can't do this anymore. So at least you know how I look, and hopefully for those of you that I haven't met yet, I will get to meet you in person in the next few months. So the first thing I want to discuss is genetic disease and what the cost of genetic disease is to our society and our healthcare system. So one of the facts that you may not be aware of is that 1 in 100 children on average are born with a genetic disease. And the problem with that is that genetic disease is quite costly, not just financially, but also emotionally and mentally for the family involved. So financially speaking, on average, the cost of genetic disease is 1.7 million to the NHS annually per child. And that figure, 1.7 million, is, like I said, an average. Some diseases are more severe than others. But on average, it is very, very costly. There is also an impact and a cost, a social one, a mental one, an emotional one to the family involved. So genetic disease is a very, very serious problem. When I talk about genetic disease, I'm referring generally to what we call rare genetic disease or rare genetic syndromes. And some of you might be thinking, well, if they're rare, why is that a problem? So the term rare is actually a little bit misleading. We refer to rare genetic disease as a disease that has an incidence of 1 in 300,000. But when we take all rare diseases and we combine them, there's approximately 300 million people that are living with a rare genetic disease globally. If we took all people living with a rare genetic disease, they would affect more people than AIDS and cancer combined. Another statistic is that there are now more than 5,000 recognized single gene disorders, so diseases that are caused by a single gene, according to the World Health Organization. And just under half of all pediatric hospitalizations are due to genetic disorders. So rare genetic disease is with us, it is a big problem, and it is impacting our healthcare systems and our society, both financially, but also, as I said, emotionally. So I want to, before I go on what we can do about it, I want to discuss a little bit about what is Mendelian inheritance. You will hear me use the words Mendelian inheritance or single gene disorders interchangeably. So we have 3 basic ways in which genetic disease is inherited, is passed on from generation to generation. So what I mean by Mendelian inheritance is a way that we inherit genetic disease. One of the ways is called dominant. So we all inherit 2 copies of a gene, one from our mother and one from our father. And generally, we only need one working copy of that gene to produce the protein that's encoded by that gene. With dominant genetic disease, we actually need 2 good working copies of that gene. So if the person has a single copy of the faulty gene, that's enough to cause the disease. So carriers of a dominant genetic disease generally show symptoms of the disease. And an example of that is neurofibromatosis, NF1. Another example of a type of inheritance is recessive or autosomal recessive, in which the person inherits a faulty copy of the gene from both their mother and their father. So they're actually carrying 2 faulty copies of the gene. And when that is the situation, then the carrier of, the person that has inherited faulty copies of the gene is going to show symptoms of the disease. Carriers, on the other hand, are healthy and they don't show any symptoms of the disease. And an example of this is cystic fibrosis, but there are thousands more. And finally, another way that we inherit genetic disease is called X-linked. So this is dependent on the gender. As you know, a female has 2 copies of the X chromosome, a male person has 1 copy of the X and a copy of the Y. The faulty gene is located on the X chromosome, so generally females are less likely to show symptoms of the disease because they have 2 X chromosomes and the 1 X chromosome is masking the other. Males are much more likely, much more frequently show the disease than females because they only have 1 copy of the X chromosome. So if they inherit that copy from their mother, and it is always maternal inheritance, if they inherit that copy from their mother, they will show symptoms of the disease. And an example of an X-linked inherited disease is Duchenne muscular dystrophy. The one that we're more concerned with is recessive, autosomal recessive, and you will see why in the next couple of slides. So focusing on autosomal recessive, as I said in my previous slide, we're now focusing on autosomal recessive inheritance. This is how this can be inherited. So we have a typical kind of family scenario. We have mother and father who are both carriers. So you see here they have 1 working copy of the gene and 1 non-working copy of the gene. They are both healthy. They show no symptoms of the disease, but they're both what we call carrier. This is how each potential pregnancy can go. So if both the mother and the father pass on the working copy of the gene to the child is not a carrier. It has 2 working copies of the gene, and obviously it's not showing the disease. So let's imagine we're talking about cystic fibrosis. So this child is not a carrier and it's not showing symptoms of the disease. And this happens in 25%, 1 in 4. If the father passes on the working copy of the gene and the mother the faulty copy of the gene, or the other way around, then the children don't have the condition, but they are themselves carriers. So they're healthy, but they're themselves carriers. And obviously they have a risk to pass that on to their children in the next generation. And in 1 in 4, so 25% of pregnancies, or rather I should say there's a 1 in 4 risk that both the mother and the father pass on the non-working copy of the gene to the child. So this child will be born with the condition, say for example, cystic fibrosis. So you can see that in this pattern of inheritance, there is a 1 in 2 risk, 50% risk of having children who are carriers, who then themselves are at risk of passing it on to the next generation. And most importantly, there is a 1 in 4 risk, 25% risk of having children who are affected. So why is carrier status a problem? Why is it important to know, to be able to detect carrier status? And it's important in all 3 types of Mendelian inheritance that I discussed, dominant, recessive and X-linked, but I will go through all 3 of them separately. So the answer to that is it's not always obvious. So it's not always obvious to a carrier that they are a carrier. In dominant disease, I did say earlier that most carriers of dominant disease will show the symptoms because you only need one copy of the faulty, of the non-working copy of the gene. However, some diseases that show this pattern of inheritance, and many cancer genes fall in this category, they don't manifest themselves in every carrier or in every generation. So, for example, the BRCA gene family that confer a much higher risk to the individual of having ovarian and breast cancer. They having a mutation in the BRCA gene doesn't mean that the person will 100% develop breast and ovarian cancer. They are at a much higher risk compared to the rest of the population that doesn't have a BRCA mutation, but they will not 100% develop the disease. So a carrier may be a carrier of a BRCA gene mutation, but they may not necessarily know it because they don't develop the disease, but they can still pass it on to one of their children or all of their children. So the penetrance of the disease, the existence of the disease, can vary from generation to generation. What I mean by penetrance is that the disease is not always obvious in every generation. So one of their children might manifest the disease. As I showed you in the previous slide, carriers of recessive disease are asymptomatic. It means they don't know the carriers of the disease, they don't show any symptoms, so they don't actually know that they run a 1 in 4 risk, 25% risk of having a child that manifests this disease. And carriers, female carriers of X-linked conditions, might not know that they're carriers themselves because they will also be asymptomatic, but they have a 1 in 2 risk of having a male child that will be affected. So you can see why carrier status is a problem for dominant recessive and X-linked conditions. As a matter of interest, maybe you don't know this, we are all carriers on average of 12 pathogenic mutations. Usually, well, the majority of children are born without genetic disease because it is unlikely that both the mother and the father have exactly the same pathogenic mutation, but as you can see, in 1% of cases, it does happen. So the take-home message from this webinar, from this presentation, is that knowing carrier status is really, really important. I'll repeat this again, knowing carrier status is really, really important. Most carriers don't know they're carriers until it is too late. And what I mean by too late is when a child is born with that genetic disease. So in the company, we've been doing prenatal diagnosis for a long, long time, and we've seen thousands of families in exactly that scenario where a child with a genetic disease, sometimes known, sometimes unknown, has been born. It has taken the family by surprise. It is a terrible shock to the family, and they weren't expecting it because both mother and father were completely healthy individuals, and they didn't know they were carriers of a genetic mutation. I should also add that many of the rare diseases that we see, that we deal with, don't show any symptoms on ultrasound. So when we think of prenatal diagnosis, we think of screening for Down syndrome and other autosomal trisomies like Patau's and Edwards, and maybe Klinefelter's, some chromosomal abnormalities, for example, translocations. With microarray, we can pick up some deletions and duplications. And these, because they are large imbalances of the human genome, they often affect multiple organs, and we do have, but they do show on ultrasound as multiple congenital abnormalities. So there's something to alert the obstetrician on the ultrasound that there is a problem with this pregnancy. With a lot of the single gene disorders that we are looking at, there are no ultrasound features at all. So there is nothing to alert the family or the obstetrician that there is something wrong with this pregnancy. A lot of the conditions that we've been investigating, for example, some of the metabolic conditions or some of the neurodevelopmental disorders, they are slightly later onset, so they don't manifest themselves until maybe the third or fourth year of the child's life. So again, for the first few months, for the first few years of the child's life, there is no evidence that there is a genetic disease. So again, I will repeat that it's really, really important to know carrier status, because most carriers don't know they're carriers until it is too late. If a couple knew they were carriers of a genetic disease, that they could pass on this life-limiting genetic disease to their children, would they leave the health of the child to chance? And this is a good question, and there is no right or wrong answer. So I will not give you the answer here, but if a couple knew that they were both carriers of a life-limiting genetic disease, would they take different decisions when they are at family planning stage? I want to mention, if you are from the UK, there was a very well-known case about 2 years ago of a child called Charlie Gard, who died of an autosomal recessive disease of mitochondrial DNA disease. In that situation, both his parents unknowingly were carriers of that fatal autosomal recessive disease. Had they known, would they have made a different decision? Again, there is no right or wrong answer, but it would mean that the couple have time to weigh up their options and decide what they want to do. The other thing I want to add is that the risk remains the same for every pregnancy. So I said there is a 1 in 4 risk with autosomal recessive disorder of having a child with a genetic disease. Just because a sick child has been born, it doesn't mean that the next 3 will be healthy. And unfortunately, it doesn't work this way. The risk is the same at the beginning of every pregnancy. So now you understand my question at the beginning of the webinar: why are we looking at preconception testing rather than prenatal testing? We're looking to prevent. We're looking at a predictive model. We're looking at a preventative model rather than a reactive one, rather than a model where it is almost too late or where the consequences are irreversible. So what can MolMart do? What are we doing to help couples? So we have a test that's called SureMart. It is a single test that screens for more than 5,000 known genetic disorders. It is one of very few tests on the market that offers preconception genetic testing and replaces many, many genetic tests to one single test. We look at the exome. If you're not familiar what that is, it is the part of the human genome that contains most of the coding genes, most of the protein coding genes. So it only represents about 1.1 to 2% of the total genome, but 85% of clinically relevant mutations are part of the exome. And this is what we're looking at for this particular test, for SureMart. I want to show you how the workflow of SureMart works. So if you are a doctor and you're listening to this, or if you have a clinic and you're listening to this, the part that is conducted at your clinic is steps 1 and 2. The rest we do ourselves. So the sampling is 5 to 10 mils of peripheral blood from each member of the couple, and we do need both members of the couple. And you send the blood to MolMart. We're based in the UK. We can facilitate if you don't live in the UK, we can facilitate this process. We work with couriers who are very used to transporting human samples. So we've got this with this process very streamlined. It's very, very simple. So we can set it all up for you. It really is very, very simple. Then we take over, we extract the DNA, we do DNA sequencing using next generation sequencing. We use our own bioinformatics platform that we have developed in collaboration with the University of Manchester bioinformatics department. So it is the data that comes out is complex, the algorithms are very complex, and we have combined our long clinical experience with a very, very prominent bioinformatics department in the UK at the University of Manchester to develop our own software. We then issue you with a clinical report. So perhaps the couple has no pathogenic mutations that they can pass on to their children, so that's great news. On occasions, they might have one, they might have two or more. So we do issue you with a very clear, with a very patient-focused clinical report where we tell you exactly what the risks are. And perhaps step 6 is the most important step. I really do not want to underestimate the importance of genetic counselling. We have our own in-house genetic counsellors that will work with you. They will actually tell the couple what the result means for them. This is really, really important. And what the options are for them. So they will talk the couple through the options that they can have following this result. So what are these options? What can the couple do? And I want to say here, there's this sort of famous phrase, knowledge is power. And in this situation, really knowledge is power, because the couple knows before they conceive if they're at risk of having a child with a genetic disease. They have the time to plan, they have the time to think what their options are and to manage any pregnancy. So they have an informed choice. We have counselled thousands of couples at prenatal, and we know how difficult it is for a couple to learn that the pregnancy is not what they had wished for. We know all the difficult decisions they have to make, and we respect all of them. In this case, we are just taking everything one step further back. We have this discussion, a preconception, where there are more options. So the couple, if they wish to conceive naturally, they have the choice of early prenatal testing, but we know the mutation, we know what we're testing for, so we can offer them that option. But we also have, in situations where there are, for whatever reason, religious or moral or cultural, wherever there is a difficulty in having to consider termination of a pregnancy, we don't need to go there, because we give the couple the option of going through IVF and implanting healthy embryos only. So they are almost certain that the fetus will not carry that genetic disease. Who is SureMart for? Well, really, any couple that wants that extra reassurance. You remember the statistic I gave you, 1% of all children are born with a genetic disease. So if you want to eliminate that 1%, if you think this is too high for you, this test is for you. More importantly, couples with known family history of diagnosed or undiagnosed suspected genetic disease. Undiagnosed is more relevant because they don't know what the problem is. So if there is a cousin, an uncle, an aunt, a relative in the family who has a disease that is suspected to be of genetic nature, we can also help you here to make sure, to reassure the couple that their children will be healthy. The last category is very, very important. This is for consanguineous couples. So SureMart is really strongly recommended for consanguineous couples. This means couples who are married within the same family nucleus. And of course, if the two members of the couple are closely related, they are at a much higher risk of sharing some of the mutations that are within that family. So they run a much higher risk of having a child with a genetic disease. That risk depends on how closely they are related. So we couldn't give you a number, but the more closely they're related, the higher the risk of having a child with a genetic disease. So this is all I want to say for this webinar. If you enjoyed it, and if you want to know a little bit more, do visit our website at molmart.co.uk. If you'd like to ask any questions, If you want more information about the test, more importantly, if you want to know how much it costs and whether you want to implement it in your business, do email me at mmickelson@molmart.co.uk. If this is a much easier email to remember, info@molmart.co.uk, or through our contact us page on our website. And if you really liked it, please do follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening, and hope you can join us for our next webinar. Thank you very much.